Thank you for coming, everyone. I wanted to introduce our distinguished panelists tonight for doing justice to gender particularities. First, we have Lisa Rehnquist, who is the Associate Professor of Art History at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. She received her PhD from UNC Chapel Hill in 2007. Rehnquist's research is primarily concerned with the intersections of childhood, religious piety, gender, and race in the art of Henry Darger. And then I want to introduce Adam Greneman. He's a PhD. He's the director of the Masters of Arts in Teaching program and adjunct assistant professor of art education at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. His scholarship explores the historical, philosophical, and educational implications of sexuality and gender in education. And then last but not least, Reverend M. Barclay, who's the first openly non-binary person to be ordained as a provisional deacon in the United Methodist Church. They were appointed as Director of Communications at Reconciling Ministries Network, where they advocate for an end to discrimination against LGBTQ persons in the United Methodist Church. Reverend Barclay received a BA in Communications in Florida before moving to Austin, Texas, where they attended grad school for a Master of Divinity. M does extensive speaking, writing, preaching, and teaching on the intersections of faith and social justice. M is pansexual and non-binary trans person who uses singular they, them pronouns. And I want to leave it up to Lisa Rehnquist, the curator of the exhibition, to give us a little bit of a run-through of the exhibition that she put together for us.
All right, thanks. I want to invite everyone to come up closer because we're going to be looking at some of the artwork, and we want to see your smiling faces too. So the show is called Betwixt and Between, the main title, and that is really gleaned from J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, and it really means between and between. It's kind of an archaic way, and so I like the redundancy of it and the repetition of it because you see a lot of repetition in Darger's work. But it's really about an indeterminate position, something neither this nor that. And given that it has those connotations, but also that tie to children's literature, I thought it would be an apt title for the show. And so we wanted to, in the show, tackle in many ways the figure of the child with intersex characteristics, also talk about gender, how gender is constructed in Darger's work, and you could maybe say deconstructed, even transcended in his work. And so the works in the show include Vivian portraits that really haven't been shown together, to my knowledge. There's works of girls that are in gardens that are coupled with flowers. There's some discussion about floral names. What are the metaphors of flowers in the work, as well as associations with girlhood. We also have images of some of his renderings and resource materials, so you can get a sense of where he gleaned his figures from and how he looked at his current culture, the media that would be coming from comic strips, other kinds of, like the Sears Roebuck catalog, for example, and how he would look at these images of girls that were reinforced by society and then transformed them into his characters, his protagonists for his novel. And these images, if you were at Michael Bonesteel's show, you realize that he wrote over a 15,000 page story, and that these images correspond to that story, but they don't exactly illustrate it. So you can almost think about Darger's work as two stories, kind of parallel, the visual and the written, and they intersect at various components. But one place where they don't is this discussion of children with intersex characteristics. That is something that really is primarily part of his visual work. And what we have in the gallery today is just a fraction of what he did. It's a very ambitious project. It's an epic project. And for me, when I look at these the figures and look at the patterns and try to find a kind of internal logic in his work. It appears to me that the children that he draws are seminal to his story. They're important to his story. He describes them as beautiful, the most beautiful children ever. He describes them as holy and innocent. And so his rendition of childhood is something that he exalts and that he optimizes, I guess you could say, with all the repetition of children over and over again. So they're a key component to his work, and there's a lot of mystery, a lot of things that are left unexplained. And so what I'm excited about hearing tonight is that as an art historian, I look to historicize the work and put it into a cultural context of the time period. But as audiences, and this is a public exhibition, everyone comes to the work with their own sense of who they are, their own kind of personal relevance. And so I'm interested in hearing what people have to say about the work, what our panelists will bring up, and where the conversations can go. So, thank you. Go ahead, Adam.
Okay. So to start off with some context that Lisa just gave, I hate talking. We actually want to kind of focus in to begin with on this piece right behind Lisa, and as opposed to us talking at you, we actually want to start with doing what we might call a long look and have you as participants actually tell us what you see in the piece. And I'm actually just going to go around the room and ask you each to tell us something you see in the piece. Please don't point, because whoever's standing next to you won't be able to see where you're pointing from. You see what you're pointing from, and don't use the word obvious, because what's obvious to you is not obvious to everyone else. So those are the two rules. Don't point and don't say obvious. But we just want to talk about what do we see, not an interpretation of what we're seeing, just what do we see, to kind of start building a kind of common sense of what this piece and then the larger conversation of Darger is going to bring. So I'm going to ask this gentleman over here to be the first to just tell us something you see in this piece.
I see flowers.
Okay.
I see action rock flinging. I see groups of people looking at the same thing.
I see girls carrying heavy objects.
I see lots of seemingly girls with big, dark eyes. That's what stands from afar, is all of these big, black eyes.
Okay. You can also move closer if you want. You don't have to be shy.
I see two girls swinging together on a swing.
I see a lot of kinetic action, girls moving things, touching things, interacting with each other.
I don't see really noses on the faces.
Okay.
I see some figures in hats and stylish outfits.
I'm intrigued by what they seem to be looking at down here in the left-hand corner, which is a bit mysterious. Maybe it's off and to the left. Yeah.
Well, it's no surprise that Deb said what I was going to say. I first noticed their clothing, their hats. There are a lot of balls around, so I'm noticing that now.
The horns, the girls with horns or the blankets, where they are, what they're doing, how they stand out.
I see flowers and trees.
I noticed that a lot of the girls are traced from the same source. They're exactly the same face, especially in that group in kind of the middle left.
I see a jungle gym.
Huh?
I see one, he looks like a boy, and it's one hanging upside down, a boy hanging upside down at that jungle gym.
I'm not supposed to point, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I broke the rules.
I see some buildings in the background over here.
Okay. I see a horse.
I see a flower as big as the trees.
Flowers.
Okay. Having heard what other people have seen, do you want to add anything else that you see that you noticed after?
Purple rocks.
Somber facial expressions.
Rocks that look like caskets or pin casket figures.
Okay.
This is sort of purple shrouded figure to the right.
Oh, a white picket fence.
See like a large lizard or a dragon in the center.
So, having seen this, looked at it longer than most people look at a piece of art in a museum, what do you make of it? What do you think of what you're seeing? Having seen purple rocks, trees, clouds, what are you thinking this piece might be trying to get us to think about? If we move from just describing what we see to offering some thoughts.
Playful, but it also feels a little dangerous.
Okay. What makes you think it feels a little dangerous?
All the heavy rocks.
Okay.
And the way they're swinging seems dangerous.
Go ahead.
I get the sense that they're trying to escape from whatever's in the background. I think there's some like small houses back there, or they're all in the forefront. So they're leaving whatever's behind them.
Okay.
I see a lot of repetition, repeated symbols, imageries in action. And it makes me wonder if there's more to the story.
They don't seem connected to each other.
What doesn't seem connected?
The figures seem to be in some ways isolated.
I see contentment,
Contentment. How do you see contentment?
kind of blissfulness. It's peaceful in a way.
I see strength. The jungle gym monkey bars are weighted down by a rock, which makes me think they're so strong that it needs extra weight, and they're moving the rocks around as if they're light as a feather, it almost looks like.
Anything else people want to raise? Questions? We're going to get to more questions. We just want to start to think about what we're seeing. And then we're going to move to two more pieces, and I'll let you. But before we do that, any final thoughts, questions? We're going to have more question and discussion in the performance space, but
Preponderance of girls.
preponderance of girls.
Mm-hmm.
It might be a nice transition point to the source material.
Sure, let's go back in. So we could continue to the traced drawing and the original source material and maybe say preponderance of girls with this. How does that change that phrase from looking at what appears to be kind of a playground to an isolated figure, a transference of information from one representation to another? What are your thoughts on this? Are many of you aware of how Darger did his rendering? You know, he would take carbon paper, trace something that's found from everyday life. And this is a girl, she's wearing roller skates. It's an ad for the dress that she's wearing. In my study of Darger, I've noticed he really hones in on girls that are moving or that express movement. She has kind of an open body stance, and her legs are parted. She's looking up, smiling. So she's oriented in a direction, and you can see how girls orient and look around and move in his pieces. And so this is kind of the flip of that, the traced image. What does Darger do in the space in between these images? Maybe that's a hard question. That's what we all want to know. But what here is still our reading of girl, because we read that on the body. That tells me girl. And where do we get that from? Yeah, Jane?
The affect and the stance, it still seems so girlish as a gender construct. Like we didn't use the word female or how they're sexed, but girl, like it still is very girl, whatever that means, whether it's naked or not.
Mm-hmm. And what still says girl?
She still has a bow in her hair.
Uh-huh.
The way she's holding her hands.
Mm-hmm. What complicates the reading of girl?
Male genitalia.
Yep, the obvious. Possibly also ambiguous, kind of a prepubescent anatomy. We know that this figure is represented as a certain age if we see it as girl, because there are no developed breasts. So we have this transformation, if you will, of girl that is constructed from society, tells us what girls look like, how they might act, what they might wear, how they would hold their body. And then here, some of that ends up on this page. And then there's actually just one element that shifts that. What other question would I ask here without getting too deep? What are your thoughts on that? Is that difficult to look at? Why would it be difficult to look at if it is? Is it surprising? Is it funny? What's our reaction to that? What do we bring to that image that Darger draws? Mm-hmm. In what way? Mm-hmm. It's still a simplified, he does a simplified kind of tracing, just enough information, like you say, to give you a nose, a little tiny bit of a nose, enough information to say bow, maybe Mary Jane shoes, a certain style of shoe, enough information to say genitalia. And so it's not belabored. It's not kind of over the top. We don't get a sense it's meant to titillate, like there is a kind of innocence to that image. So it slips through a lot of cracks for us. It's hard to place it somewhere, to put it in a category of understanding of something that might be familiar to us. And that makes it good art, I think. It makes it great art, actually. And for someone who wasn't trained as an artist, where does that come from? We can trace, some things of, we see Shirley Temple. We know where that comes from, and maybe why he might be interested in her. But where does that come from? That's the big question. So these, I think, are instructive because they isolate and they kind of show us a bit of process, and maybe we might think about thinking, because he's also defrocking that figure. He's not totally tracing, but when you look at the figure, you can see where the body is, though. It doesn't take a lot to kind of trace along the body underneath that little jumper dress. There's some more images here where this image might make sense looking at this here Roebuck ad, and that her attire is almost kind of transparent. As you can see in that attire, you can see kind of the shape of the body, and he shows us the shape of the body almost kind of in this transparent skirt. These are my favorite girls of Henry Darger's because they have the braids, and the braids have their own life force. They flip around, they move around, they show us if they're jumping or not. This figure is somewhat replicated here, and they almost seem kind of comical in the way that they're more animated than some of the other images are. They have their shoes on all the time, which is also kind of funny. They're not typically without their shoes. So there are little quirky elements that might be kind of small and micro that you pick up on. You might say, well, there's a big quirky element, possibly, or a big kind of mystery here. But there's also these funny little details that he retains in the work. And we read those details. We read them as a gendered kind of detail that tells us something. It signals. It's a code and a convention in his work that he continues to maintain, even though he disrupts those codes and conventions with his representations.
So one thing for me as a queer and trans pastor in the Christian tradition, I was just exposed to this work last week, one thing that I'm really interested in, knowing that he was a very religiously devout person in the Catholic tradition in particular, one of the things that I see in his work that I make a connection to the Christian narrative around in particular is transgression. And I think when we talk a lot about things like gender and religion, and how they intersect, we often use words like transcend, but I really want to stick with the word transgress in his work, because I see him playing with a lot of gender conventions at the time, expectations of girls, and transgressing all of that, not even transcending, but really saying, you've been given this little girl presented in this particular way through all of the mass media being marketed at you, but I'm transgressing your expectations of her and what she's capable of, lifting heavy rocks and defeating warriors, holding these dragon lizard kind of symbols, and of course the Christian tradition is all about doing the same sort of thing, transgressing expectations, transgressing power dynamics, and not just for the purpose of being provocative, but for the purposes of liberation, for the purposes of bringing healing to the marginalized, bringing liberation to the marginalized. And so I wonder if there's any conscious or subconscious connection to his faith in the ways that he is taking marginalized figures and transgressing society's expectations of them, perhaps for the purposes of some kind of internal or external liberation for him or for those who would engage his work.
Here's a question.
I want to ask a somewhat provocative question. The interpretation of the genitalia, I think, is complex. And I'd love to hear what you guys' thoughts are. I'm a physician, and I look at it, and I actually see acromegaly. I don't see a penis. And it's very common in certain genetic conditions, Klinefelters and other syndromes, to see that kind of anatomy. But I wonder if that's what his intent was. And I'd love to hear what you guys think.
I'm not familiar with that term. Would you mind putting it in a layperson's
So there are
definition?
depending on the phase of genital development, if there's an excess of androgen at critical stages, then you can get a syndrome that results in masculinization. But it's not a penis. It's the enlargement of the clitoris. And to me, it appears like the labia and clitoris as opposed to the penis. My hunch is that that's not what his intent was. It was meant to be more from a blurring sort of female that.
Well, we had a short discussion before the program tonight, and we were talking about that kind of, if you will, bodily configuration is not consistent. So there will be renderings where the genital region is not even finished in its drawing, just kind of vacant. There are renderings where there's a V-shaped, which might be read as female sex, and then there's renderings that are read as male. And so it's that in itself is not consistent and not a given in any kind of circumstance. And my discussion about where I see a lot of these types of bodies being represented typically happens when there's some sort of peril or danger, or there's a kind of dramatic situation. That is I would say, more not a definitive kind of statement. That happens a lot, but there are also some exceptions to that too, where the figures are just quiet and standing. And my other thought about that is, why are there figures that are fully clothed, and then why are there figures that are not? Or, they have Mary Jane shoes on and a bow in their hair. And so there's, to me, some sort of significance to that as something to be read and acknowledged. There's a intention on the artist that this is something I want to make visible in various situations, because the girls on the piece in the front of the building, in front of by the door, are fully clothed and they're shooting and they're on the train tracks. And so there was a decision there that was made by the artist to fully clothe them, while the pieces in the back of the space, there was a different decision made. And so that makes me wonder, what is the pattern there, what's going on? So something is significant, but as you say, what exactly is that significance? And it's a few simple pencil marks, and then how do we interpret that as clearly as a kind of anatomy? Yeah.
For me, it's an interesting dilemma, because is it getting ambiguity,
Mm-hmm.
or is it suggesting that by giving a woman a large clitoris, that perhaps there's some power that goes with that? I don't know.
Yeah.
Got my head, but it's an interesting, and I don't know what the writing suggests. If there's anything at all in the writing that helps with interpret this.
Not that I'm aware of, and from Michael Bonesteel's in the audience here too. From other scholars, there's kind of a consensus that that's not even approached in his writing. That's there visually, but not in the written thoughts, in the storyline, in the narrative. Yes. Right. And it's not even in, there are little captions and sometimes speech bubbles that you'll see in the work, and it's not in there either. The thing that I find also of interest in that might be related to this is that the girls are given ages, and then they have age-appropriate clothing too that are roughly around age 6 through 11, which is, you know, prepubescent. And it's also, I'm not an expert at all on this, and my understanding is there's kind of a lot of gender fluidity in that time period, and children are figuring out who they are, and they may reach for the G.I. Joe toy instead of the Barbie, and then are corrected or not by their parents. But there's a kind of exploration of self, and so there is a kind of fluid point where kids even think they're vampires or something. You know, there's a lot of imaginative play in terms of identity, and so it seems like to me, he's picking a specific moment of childhood where he sees potential as protagonists, but also possibly for this kind of gender fluidity too. Other questions, thoughts, concerns?
I have one other comment, and that is that I was altered when I saw the original show at the Hyper Art Center millions of years ago. And it's so interesting now to come back and revisit it, because I don't see any of the things that really altered me back then. I see the tapestry of the design and the colors, and it's a really different experience. Maybe it's because I'm a young. It's really amazing how you can view this, I think, from such different perspectives.
It's encyclopedic, you know, once you look at what's in the work, and then you begin, it's hard to find an entry point to enter into the work and think about it, because there's so much going on. It's, you know, reverberating polka dots and children that are changelings, if you will, you know, and horns and tails and martyrdoms, and so it's a lot all at once. And if you have a chance to read into some of the chapters in the volumes, he begins with addressing a reader. Dear reader, basically, I'm going to take you on this fantastic journey, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm going to make you feel like you're there. I'm going to bring you to this place and tell the story from both sides. And so it's the rich storytelling, the desire for that is there in the written components, and then really, I think they're in these panoramas that are kind of cinematic and show you everything, you know, the all-seeing, every little detail and the far off and the horizon. I think the ambition of doing that is pretty spectacular. Anything you want to say, Adam?
Kind of want to address the fact that different visitors have come to the show, and certain visitors had issues in the beginning of certain text that was written. Do you want to expand on that, Lisa, or is that something that we can maybe use that as a jumping off point?
Yeah, why don't we talk about language, and nomenclature, and the changing times of that. Would either you want to jump in on that?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so I think that especially the more aware we become of trans people and intersex people, the more conscious we become about how sensitive we should be when we make assumptions about bodies. And certainly it's complicated when we're talking about an art piece. You know, they're certainly not humans who can be offended by your interpretation, but how we interpret them speaks to how we interpret other people, right? And so anytime we're looking at a body, assuming based on gender presentation and or genitalia that we can make an assumption about who they are in any way is certainly inaccurate at best. And so I can imagine that somebody walks into a space like this with a body that is, not that we should make assumptions about anybody's body, that's the thing, right? Whether the Vivian girls had one kind of genitalia or another, ideally, in a completely trans-friendly world, we're not making an assumption about them at that point either. But knowing that this art piece definitely invites provocative conversation around gender presentation, around gender identity, it definitely presents a challenge, and I think an important one, about how we just read bodies and how we interact with them, and how we take note of how we respond internally when we see something that defies, again, transgresses our expectations of what a little girl's body should look like, according to us. So I like that it invites us to kind of question why it's such a provocative image to us, and also invites us, I hope, to think about how we read bodies in other pieces as well, and what might be okay with that, and what might be something that we need to even reconsider about how we view other art pieces, other human beings, and what assumptions we're making about the bodies behind the clothes that are often painted onto art pieces.
I think the other part of this, though, especially when it first was viewed, is that it's naked children, which our culture is kind of difficult for some, and I think that's the other thing, putting the gender issue aside, is just the nudity in children is trying to address.
I'll be speaking about that some on Saturday, but kind of bringing this in with language, when we say naked or nude, we have different connotations of what that means. And so nudity is more friendly art term, and it's kind of, there's the still life, the landscape, the nude. And the nude is more of a neutral term, and more of a term that we associate with having a sense of self. And we talk about the heroic nudity. Michelangelo's David is a heroic nude. Nakedness tends to be a term used to describe images of slaves or someone in the state of undress or vulnerable. And we do interchange them. Darger even used the word nuded at some point, which seems like, well, it happens. They were nuded by the storm that came. But the sense of, I'll be talking about innocence and images of children from the early 20th century, and Darger's collection of images of children, and how innocence was viewed at that time period, and how that correlated to that. I know my parents took pictures of me in the bathtub with my friends that I went to high school with, but I was a little child, and that's what you did, and it was cute. It was considered cute and innocent and part of childhood, but at some age you quit taking those photographs. There is a kind of boundary there, and a sense of when nudity is not considered innocent, but we, and as in our society we also associate it with repressed desire, which is Freudian kind of thing, and so we have these conflicting and parallel associations with children, and so even though they're just simple kind of cartoonish drawings of children, people do have, and I teach at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. I've had students that have had adverse reactions and like, what is this about? And so we'll talk about it and kind of unpack it, but your initial reaction is something's going on here that I'm not comfortable with right away on the first layer of naked or nude children, how you kind of view that. And so, so that's, I try to kind of put that in my thoughts about, that's also a sign or symbol of something important happening at that moment, to render the children in that way. There's something there going on that enhances the moment, possibly, and for some people it might be eroticizing as an enhancement, or is it an enhancement about heroic nudity, or the Garden of Eden? Is it prelapsarian? Is it before the fall? And so that means wholesomeness, goodness, you know. So a naked body is an ambiguous sign and symbol that we read. You know, I often talk to my students about images, especially of women, of the Venus that covers herself is an image of modesty, but Eve that covers herself is an image of shame. And they're both the same gesture. And so it's all about context, and we don't know what that context is for Darger, you know. It's not so obvious to us.
But it would be possible. I mean, there are hundreds of works.
Yes.
So you could look at the context and see if he's consistent within or between
Right.
names.
Yes. If you can find them all. Yeah.
That's all online. You can go to the website and see a lot of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, if you had 50 of them.
I think probably one of the best ways would be to get the spines from the three original, the images. Many of the I call them the mature works, you know, the bigger works were bound together in a book format. And so the Folk Art Museum in New York has 2 spines, and I think Kyoko Lerner has 1. I might be mistaken on that. And there's just about this much visual information because all the pieces were cut out of the books. And if you could connect that little bit of visual information that's still in the spine with an image, then you could maybe see a narrative come up, a sequence come up that might be helpful. And when you open them up, so if you can imagine opening and opening and opening these big sprawling pieces, what would they say side by side too? What would they show? So yeah, I think that's a key element, and that could even be done digitally, scanning, and then that's a great project for a graduate student or a grant. But yeah, I think being able to kind of glean that and then figure out if there is a narrative that finding all the pieces, and then if you could see how they were originally assembled, that would be really instructive, I think.
A lot of the works are numbered as well, and some scholars have talked about a sequence in terms of numbering, but then Darger often had the same number twice, so
right.
You know, it just gets mixed up that way.
Yeah.
But I want to mention something from earlier in the discussion, that in the writing, the nudity was originally because the child slaves would escape from their masters, and by nuding the children, they were easier to spot and catch and capture again. That was the excuse that Darger gave in the writing. Of course, there's no talk about genitalia in that, but in terms of actual nudity. And the other thing that I noticed was that most of the nude work is in the mid-career bodies of work. The earlier work and the later work, the children are clothed again, but for a certain period of time, it seems that he was predisposed to having his children without clothing. So that, you know, for whatever reason. You know. And I think that was probably the most violent period in the middle as well. So, and that was when the works got pretty large.
Yeah, and some of the, I'm not Catholic, but some of the reading I've done about the Catholic faith is that the body is the locus of piety and of worship. And so the Immaculate Conception, stigmata, signs on the body, and the transformation of the body, or transgression of the body too, in some ways, are these moments when the kind of carnality of the flesh, or, you know, Christ coming to the world as a baby, like being incarnated. That flesh, the body, is really important. So I wonder if Darger, I know you should never kind of say, this is what Darger intended, but is it important to see the body at these moments? That's why they're not clothed, possibly.
Adam, do you want to reflect a little bit on the language of, you know, intersex and characteristics?
I mean, I think Lisa actually covered a lot of that complexity along with the question from the gentleman in the back, right? That I think we were talking beforehand that in the kind of dominant discourses we're having right now, right, we're talking a lot about trans issues. I think the choice of using intersex, right, complicates that and adds the kind of intersexed issue that oftentimes gets collapsed with the trans issue. And so actually kind of attending to the body via the representation in art brings to the table conversations that I actually don't think are as mainstream of thinking about the diverse ways in which we are embodied with our genitalia. Even going to the ways in which the medical world uses particular medicalized terms to think about that versus kind of an intersex activist community that kind of pushes against the ways in which the medical community medicalizes those very bodies. And I think the ways artists then kind of transgress and, in a sense, seek to transform those discourses. I think Darger allows us to read into the contemporary moment in ways that Darger probably couldn't have ever predicted, but in a contemporary realm, I think allows us to, because of the ways a curator then brings in new language to think about it, is an interesting, I think, contemporary way of using Darger to think about the very contemporary moment we're in, of grappling with bodies and minds, and not asking trans people about their bodies, but then also thinking about the intersex community and the ways in which the body is cut up and cut apart in different ways. But that's less about Darger himself, but the way in which Darger can provoke conversation, I think. I'm not sure if that was an intention of yours to kind of bring attention to the body in that way. If you want to talk about the choice of intersex, if that was...
Well, I've written a couple of articles in the past 7-8 years, and I go back and I reread them on occasion, and I would change some of the language and reconsider and consult with someone who is much more on the forefront of thinking about transgender issues. It's transgendered is something, a transgendered person, you don't refer to it as kind of a verb in the past tense. And so there are many things that as a scholar, as a professor, that I learn. I learn a lot from my students too, sitting in my class, and I often facilitate those questions and those moments and those discussions, and learn from them and be open to that, because it's an ever-changing landscape. And often my students know more about that than I do. And so, that's part of my scholarship on Darger that I didn't expect to encounter as much. And it's part of the responsibility of doing a good job as a scholar to follow up on that and to think about the language I use and to be specific in terms of what are we really looking at, if we can be specific. But I do try to embrace ambiguity with the work and hopefully provide a kind of comfort level for that ambiguity, because we can't overly pathologize the artist or assume certain things or bring too much or overreach in our own kind of political, cultural baggage that we bring to the work, but try to be sensitive to also the artist and let the art be art, not so much a diagnosis. And so, I do think of Henry Darger as an artist who developed a sweeping body of work, and I try to be respectful of that and not, you can't help bringing your own sense of self. You know, you're not always, you try to be objective, but that's not possible. You know, it's kind of in art history, the sense of, you know, having a sense of, you know, stepping back and an academic viewpoint of it. You do bring yourself to the table with that academic viewpoint. And so Edward Gomez, who interviewed me for the hyperallergic article, asked me, and he said, I hope this is not something that will offend you, but because you know, you identify as a woman, are you interested in the girls? Like, did that bring you to the girls immediately? And I said, well, maybe, I don't know, but you know, what's in my head is that that wasn't addressed. I didn't think that was addressed very well in the current scholarship, and so I wanted to, and that's a challenge, it's a real challenging part of the work. So I wanted to attempt to address that, and, but I must admit, growing up, you know, I was instructed on how to act, what to wear. Lisa, cross your legs, you know, like sit like a lady. And, you know, I can't help but look at these girls and be like, yeah, you know, like they're doing what they want to do. They're kind of running wild and they're making things happen. And there's something kind of empowering in that, and funny and playful and free-spirited that I enjoy in the work. So I have to admit, there's a little bit of me that is interested in wanting to be a Vivian in some way, I guess.
Yeah, and something I really appreciate about your work is how it deals, I mean, I think that, you know, generally in contemporary literature, not even contemporary, but literature for a long time has made a sharp distinction between sex and gender. They're not the same thing, you know, right? And when we approach Darger's work, I'm going to use a philosophical term here, we're phenomenologically provoked, right? Like we have to reconcile with our own experience. Like you said, what are we bringing to the artwork? Which is why I loved that activity that you made us do. You know, what are you noticing, you with your particular set of experiences, right, that are due to your life experience? What are you noticing? What is being sussed out of the work for you because of those experiences? And I think that there's a lot of possibility in Darger's work to talk about that, talk about the way that we are taught to presuppose things about bodies that are othered or have been traditionally othered. And I think that, you know, your article does a wonderful job of sort of opening up that opportunity to talk about that, and also, you know, to sort of ontologically or contextualize the reason why Darger may have been doing that at the time he was doing it. It's not really a question, but just something that I noticed that was kind of at the outline of a lot of the things that the three of you were saying.
Yeah, I think there's going to be more potential in studying the resources, the things that he collected, the articles that he clipped, really doing a thorough study of the types of images that were he was attentive to, and the details in those images that he wanted to transfer into his work. I think those things are telling, and they're not just items that he copied or adapted. They have their own kind of cultural resonance. They're things that we read into. And so I think that has to come into the work. And whether or not he saw that, you know, we won't really know that, but we do read that. We do feel that when we look at the work.
Any closing thoughts? And I think, you know, just to further the discussion, or like just to end with, or I don't know if anybody has any more questions, but I think your experience kind of really folds into the fact that Darger was religious, but then, you know, his identity, and trying to find that identity maybe through his work. And I don't know what you can share, or you know, your thoughts coming in so fresh to you.
I don't know that I have any particularly well-developed thoughts around that, but as somebody so queer and trans and commissioned in the United Methodist Church, where we still are explicitly anti-LGBTQ in policy and practice. And I mean, certainly overreaching and reading into any of his work, but things that, again, might resonate for me with some of the things he does is taking something that is traditionally used in harmful ways, which I think about the advertising and the different pieces that he pulled from in the harmful ways that little girls are stereotyped, and he queers it. He queers it in terms of their body and their expression, but also in what little girls are allowed to do, much like you were speaking to. I think I find that to be very much in line with my own personal tradition in the Christian faith, is to take something that has been used traditionally, that's starting to become a harmful thing. You know, when religion becomes harmful, that's when Jesus shows up and queers it and says, actually, I'm going to transgress all of this and do it differently for the purposes of liberation. And we see that in the saints. Lisa's done some really interesting work on drawing some connections between some of the saints, like Saint Perpetua, who certainly had some queer elements to her own life before she was martyred. And I think that there's just a lot of really interesting ways that we can think about things that have a lot of traditional value, a lot of cultural significance, but if we can just queer them a little bit using imagination and our own personal experiences, they can become a totally different thing with a totally different meaning and a totally different power in our own lives and in culture. And I think those symbols and the way that we can play with them is really meaningful.
Do you want to define when you say queer?
Yeah.
Because you use it as a verb too, and there might not everyone might be familiar with that.
Sure. So to queer something is to kind of blur the lines between expectations of something. So he takes these coloring books, these advertisements, and just completely shifts the boundaries of what those images should symbolize. And he moves them just a little bit. He maintains them and queers them, blurs the boundaries so that they become both what they were, but also a stranger version. Right? That's how the word queer was used for so long, as you're weird, you're strange. Well, yeah. So when we queer something, we strange it with intentional purpose.
Okay. So, parting thoughts?
So I have a parting thought. Lisa, I want to especially thank you for bringing this exhibit to us. You and I had this conversation before that this was not quite a last minute addition to our schedule this year to celebrate Darger, but I continue to think that it was a really magical moment when you and I said, let's make this happen, and we turned it around really quickly. So I'm really pleased to have this exhibit here, to have this opportunity, I think, to really think differently about Darger and gender, and to, I think, break some of the mythology that had been there before. So I'm really excited about that. But I also am very excited in a time when we are thinking about accessibility and welcoming and being more open to everyone, being a safe place for everyone. Intuit has always been very passionate about that, but I think we're more passionate than ever. And you have given us an opportunity to open up this dialogue and to welcome our entire panel tonight and create one more avenue for new audiences to reach us. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. You're welcome. It's exciting for me to be able to do the show and to continue thinking about Darger's work, the meaning that it's created within it, what it means to us, how it is inclusive and reaches people in unusual ways, in ways you wouldn't think of. And I can, as I teach in a classroom, and I always put Darger in my classes somehow, and my students know that I work on Henry Darger's art, and so I see my students becoming more interested in it all the time and more open to talking about it and asking questions and feeling comfortable with it. And I think that's a great thing. And so I think we're kind of at this moment in, even in the field of outsider art, of digging deeper and thinking more critically about what we're looking at and talking about it in ways that provide, different paths and contexts for understanding. And so it's a very exciting moment in the field of outsider art too.